I invite you to open up in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We got a lot of reading to do this morning. And I would like for us all to be gone before the monsoon shows up. So we're going to do a lot of reading. I'm not going to talk any faster than normal. I think it's going to be a longer sermon, so maybe that just contradicted what I just said. But Ecclesiastes chapter 3, you will need your Bible. We're going to be doing a lot of reading today. A lot of different passages. As most of you know, we're in the middle of our yearly theme called Looking at Life Backwards, where we look at kind of the things of the past and see how we can live our life moving forward. And I think Ecclesiastes 3 is a great way to kind of stop and re-examine some things and focus specifically just on the things that are mentioned within these verses. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting in verse 1, he says, "There's an appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven. There's a time to give birth, there's a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and then a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to throw stones, and then a time to gather those stones. A time to embrace, and a time to shun embracing. A time to search, and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart, a time to sew together. There's a time to be silent, there's a time to speak. A time to love, there's a time to hate. There's a time for war, and then there's a time for peace." I would imagine if I would ask everybody what their most familiar part of the book of Ecclesiastes is, this is probably it. Most of us, if we have never read Ecclesiastes before, even people out in the world, they've never read the Bible before, they only think about Ecclesiastes, they probably recognize these 8 verses. They talk about this balance of things, how there's a time for this, and there's a time for that. There's a time to embrace, for instance, and there's a time to make sure you stay 6 feet social distancing away from people. There's a time for these types of things. And scholars call this the catalog of times because this literally talks about all these different things that seem like it's almost in perfect working order. You have a file folder here, you have a file folder here, you have a file folder there. Everything has its categorical place. But the real question is, as you look at all of this, is why does Solomon spend so much time on all of these different times, talking about time for this, time for that? You could have made your point in 2 or 3 verses. And specifically for Solomon, who oftentimes will usually use as few words as possible unless he's feeling especially verbose, he usually only uses a few verses to describe a general concept until he moves forward. And so it seems like in these longer sections, of which there are 3 of these types of things, the time where Solomon kind of stops and takes stock of everything that he's mentioned before that, on all 3 of these sections, it's almost as if he kind of takes a step back. He analyzes what he's done up until that point, and then he ponders the best path moving forward. And certainly if you read up until Ecclesiastes chapter 3, this makes sense. Because up until this point, he's talked about how all these rivers and all these things kind of fall back into their normal place. Sea goes out to the river, and then the river goes out to the sea. It's this circular nature of life. And then talks in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 about how there's no end to the pursuit of all the pleasures that this life can have. And so by the time you get to Ecclesiastes 3, now he takes a step back from all these kind of loosey-goosey types of things, and he says, let's recreate the structure that's happening in life. There's a time for this, there's a time for that. There's a time in which these actions are appropriate, and then there's a time when these actions are not appropriate. But people have looked at Ecclesiastes chapter 3 for a long time and wondered, what is this whole section about? What does this actually teach me? Because if I'm looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I want to derive some lessons from that. That's the whole point of Bible study, is to derive some lessons from it to gain a deeper understanding of Scripture. So what do these 8 verses teach us? I'll be first and foremost, the thing that it teaches us is everything has a season. There's no end to all the seasons that take place. And some people look at this very fatally. They say, well, there's a time to laugh, and then there's a time to weep. There's a time to be born, there's a time for life, there's a time for adventure, there's a time for excitement, and then unfortunately, there's a time for death. And the only problem with looking at it strictly through that lens is it makes us almost slaves to the life that we live around us. That I have no control over my actions, I have no control over my path forward. Literally, I am just a vehicle that is swept along through life. I'm just kind of a boat that's caught in a storm. That's a very fatalistic viewpoint to look at it. Other people say, well, the other issue is that there are these good times and then there are bad times. There are good times that happen and then eventually there will be bad times. It's just kind of inevitable. That it doesn't really matter what you do in life because no matter how great you aspire to be, at some point you're going to get knocked off that pedestal. And that's a very cynical viewpoint. I think a skewed viewpoint. Because I've heard more than one person talk about all the things that they have done that are great in their life. I'm ascending to a higher position in my company. I'm making straight A's in school. I'm doing all these things. And then some guy will walk along and say along the lines, well, you better enjoy it while it lasts. Well, that's fine. But let's not rain on everybody's parade here. So the idea that there are good times and there are bad times is just kind of an inevitable fact of life. People say that you can only count on two things, death and taxes. There's a third thing you can count on. There are going to be good times, and then there are going to be bad times. And the third thing you got to think, pull away from this passage is that we need to take advantage of that time. Ecclesiastes is a zero-sum game. And Solomon, throughout the whole book, all these chapters, has a very unique relationship with death. Because he views death as kind of the zero factor. He kind of categorizes it as the master debit that moves out of your account. That no matter what you accumulate in this life, no matter what you do, it all becomes null and void the day that you die. And that's the wrestling that he has in this entire book. And ultimately, he kind of arrives at these conclusions over and over again, that with the time you have, you need to make use of it, and then brings the question, what you do at that time. So Ecclesiastes is a very nihilistic book, it's a very fatalistic book, and that he views death as being the end-all, the be-all for everybody, and that how you live your life up until that point either matters or maybe it doesn't. So no matter what you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, no matter how you view the book, these lessons you can take from that. And I have heard sermons, I have heard Bible classes where these exact 3 points were used and said, that's all we need to know, stand and sing. And I'll admit, I entertained that notion for about 3 seconds. And then we would definitely get out of here before the rain hits. But those aren't the only 3 lessons you can pull from this. On the surface, sure, you can say everything has a season. There are good times, there are bad times. We take advantage of them. That makes it for a great sermon. But I think Solomon challenges us to go deeper. I don't think Solomon just says there's all these things that happen and then there's these things that don't happen. And then he moves on to chapter 4 and says nothing has happened. I think he's challenging us to go deeper. And I think what he's helping us to understand through these 8 verses, first and foremost, is the fact that we are not masters of our own universe. Now, I don't think that is a novel concept to anybody. But how many people have done this kind of in everyday life? For instance, in one of these passages, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 6, he says there is a time to find and there is a time to lose. There's a time to find things and there's a time to give up on finding things. All of us have seen this in our everyday life. How many of us have lost something in our house that we know we put on the counter, it was right there, it was there 5 minutes ago, and now it's gone? It always happens with socks at our house. I know I put socks in the dryer, and then the dryer monster came by and ate all the socks. I don't know where the socks are. And you can turn, literally, if you were the Hulk, you could take the dryer, you could shake the dryer, you could go up the dryer vent, you could go in the garage. It is not there. There is a time, ladies and gentlemen, to search for those things, and there's a time to just give up on it. Because no matter what rank you are at your job, no matter how much power and money you have in the bank, you still cannot find that sock. There's a time to look, and there's a time to give up. We all realize that we're not masters of our own universe in a whole lot of big ways and a whole lot of little ways. I'm not even master of my backyard. If you've gone to my house anytime recently, which not a lot of people have because of COVID, you know that I'm in the middle of a lawn renovation project. And try as I can to kill my Bermuda, my neighbor St. Augustine that is creeping in my yard, I cannot kill it. And so what good is me thinking that I can control everything when I can't even control my backyard? And that's ultimately what Job needed to realize. I want you to look at Job 38, starting in verse 1. You go through this entire book of the book of Job, and Job primarily has one complaint that he brings to God over and over and over again. And his complaint is not necessarily about the injustice of everything, although that certainly kind of falls into the line of all these different things. The ultimate argument that Job has against God is, I want to argue with you about the same things. This seems inequitable to me. And Job seems to get a little bit of a station and says, the things that you did, I don't agree with, because it doesn't line up with my view of justice in this world. That's Job's overall complaint. Job is a righteous man. He has every reason to believe that he has an adequate standing before God. But then he postures up, looks at God, and says, I don't think that you were fair in that instance. And so I want to plead my case to show exactly how wrong you were. In Job chapter 38, verse 1, God has this kind of master dialogue with him. And in Job chapter 38, starting verse 1, it says, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, which, by the way, that would be enough for me to just kind of keep my mouth shut. Tornado starts talking to me. I admit that I don't know everything. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? By the way, Job would say the same thing in 42. He would say, I am that person that darkens counsel by words without knowledge. God says, verse 3, now gird up your loins like a man. I will ask you. You instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. God gets so sarcastic, and I love it. Who set its measurements? Since obviously you know. Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Who made its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Where were you when all that happened? I might have missed you in the grand scheme of creation, Job, to think that you could do anything along these lines. You look at verse 12. God says, have you ever in your life commanded the morning? Have you ever caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal. They stand forth like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, the uplifted arm is broken. I love what he says in those verses because he doesn't just talk about Job's inability to be there at the creation of the world. God is essentially saying, while I was busy creating the universe, what were you doing? I remember you being there at all. Kind of when you show up at a group project the day it's due, and you have the group project at the end as a teacher, some guy that's in your group that never showed up wants to take credit for it. We've all been there. I remember you being there in the library when this was going on. But then he says here in verses 12 through 15, it's not just about the fact that you weren't there. You don't have the power to do these things. When I stamped my seal on the morning and put my imprint on the day, God says, you were not there. When I commanded the blessings to flow to this point and no further, when I commanded the actions of the world to move in this way, but not to go there, where were you when all that happened? As Job, or as God comes on in these next 3 or 4 chapters, he challenges him concerning the Leviathan, the behemoth. And he doesn't just say, you can't wrangle with these guys. He says, you can't put a hook in the ocean and pull the Leviathan out even if you try. So who are you to challenge me, God says? Yet all of us, even though we look at this and we think, I can't believe how silly Job was, that Job thought that he could challenge God. All of us do this. I want to give you a show of hands, but how many people within the last week have looked up to God and said, why did this happen? Why is this going on? All of us have said things like that. And what Ecclesiastes chapter 3 teaches us is that we are not masters of the universe because the universe has a very binary perspective. There are good times, there are bad times. And we cannot turn by force of our own strength those good times into bad times. We can't turn those bad times into good times by the sheer weight of our will. Now, can we make things better? Yes. Should we make things better? Yes. But I can't go over into Palestine right now, that Israel-Gaza conflict, and walk into the middle of a missile launch and say, guys, just stop it. I don't have that power. I can't even kill my grass. I don't have that type of power. And yet we realize that life has a very cyclical nature, has a very binary perspective. Things happen, things don't happen. Things move, things don't move. So we have to understand our own limitations in this life. If you look, for instance, at Matthew, the 5th chapter, I think Jesus touches on this, understanding a little bit. The Sermon on the Mount, he says a lot of things that are very wise for us all to understand, but one of the things that he does the most is helps us put our own relationship with God into perspective, and ultimately our own relationship with spirituality into perspective. In Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 33, he says, again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, and you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, but it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. I've heard people debate over and over again about vows. Should we take vows? Should we not take vows? Are vows unscriptural? Are vows okay before God? It's not really the point here. The point is, he mentions here, verse 34, you can't make these vows because you can't enact and punish people that break those vows. Verse 36, nor should you make an oath by your head, for you can't make one hair white or black. Don't let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Beyond these, anything is evil. Look at chapter 6 now. Look one chapter over in chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 24. Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 24. No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot, not should not will not, you cannot serve God and wealth. For this reason I say to you, don't be worried about your life, as to what you'll eat, what you'll drink, nor your body as to what you'll put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? After all, look at the birds of the air, that they don't sow, nor reap, nor gather in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? These verses hit home to me because I am by my very nature a worrier. I tend to think about the future. I tend to think about my actions, how they're going to impact people, and how they're going to, how the whole state of the world is going to hinge, obviously, on how I react tomorrow. A very inflated paranoia that I have, I guess. But notice what he says in verse 27. It's the exact same thing he said in chapter 5. Who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? Now, I want to point something out about this verse. The whole point of this verse and the verse that happens in chapter 5 is not to, and I want you to listen to this, the point is not to argue that you should give up control. The point of these verses is to say you never had control in the first place. That's a very important concept that I think we need to remember. He's not saying in this passage, don't make vows because you shouldn't turn your hair white or gray. That's not what he says. He doesn't say you shouldn't worry about the future because you don't want to move time forward. He doesn't say you shouldn't do it. He says you can't do it. And if you can't do it, then you should stop trying to do it. In Matthew chapter 7, for instance, right here in verse 7, he says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and it will be open to you. What a liberating verse when you take it in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open. For what man is there among you, verse 9, who when his son asks for a loaf will give him a stone? When he asks for a fish, he's not going to give him a snake, will he? If you then being evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? All of us have asked for scorpions and snakes. All of us have asked for stones. All of us, with our limited amount of information based on our very narrow viewpoint of the world that we live in, at this point in time, all of us have asked for snakes. And yet God didn't give them to us, even though we knew in that moment that's what we wanted. God didn't give us those snakes, even though we asked for them. What you need to realize is that we are not masters of our own universe. We don't have the power, we don't have the will, and we certainly don't have the perspective to know what the universe needs every single day. What do we have a responsibility for? Verse 12, and everything therefore. Treat people the same way that you want to treat them. For this is the law of the prophets. I cannot control the way the world hangs in the balance. I can't control what's going to happen overseas. I can't control when COVID is going to end. I can't control my own backyard and my socks. So why am I trying? There are other things that are masters. God is the master of the universe. What I can control is how I treat people. It's how I talk in everyday situations. It's how I handle scenarios. That's the stuff that I can't control. I can't control if I'm going to walk into the doctor next week and get a terrible diagnosis, but I can control my response to that diagnosis. We are not masters of our own universe, but we are masters of our reactions to the universe. I coined that. You can't use that anymore. You have to figure it out. Number 2, I think it teaches us that life has a very particular balance. This is something that Solomon talked about. If you go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 7. We mentioned it a little bit at the beginning. But if you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 7. He talks about this cyclical nature of life, if you will. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 7, he says, all the rivers flow to the sea, and yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome, verse 8. Man isn't able to tell it. The eye isn't satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be. And that which has been done is that which will be done. So there is absolutely nothing new under the sun. The very first realization that Solomon comes to throughout the course of Ecclesiastes is that there is nothing new under the sun. Oh look, a brand new river appeared. Guess what? It's gone tomorrow. Turn around the next day. Oh look, a brand new river appeared. Oh, it's gone back tomorrow. It's the same water. Same cycle, same situation. It just kind of repositions itself. Life has a particular balance. It's cyclical in nature. Good times, bad times. And that balance, ladies and gentlemen, is what we need to realize. I don't know the intricate details of every single person's life in this building this morning. Remember, I'm not the master of my own universe. I don't know the intricate details of every single person's life that's sitting in this building this morning. But I am confident that I'm talking to at least a few people who are going through what I would argue, or they would argue, is one of the darkest times of their life. And those people probably put every ounce of effort they had into getting up this morning, getting dressed, drinking 1 to 9 cups of coffee. I'm not here to judge. They showed up. And they sang the songs, they took the Lord's Supper, they followed along with Psalm 23, which is a fantastic psalm to read on a day like today. And they were here. And tomorrow they'll get up and it'll be a monumental challenge for them to get out of bed and do the exact same thing. And next week it may be a monumental challenge for them to do the exact same thing. And what this lesson teaches us, Ecclesiastes chapter 3 teaches us, is that just as soon as those evil days are here, there will be sunshine. It may not happen tomorrow. It may not happen next month, but it will happen. And when we have that unique perspective throughout life, not in the sense of I hope better days are coming, but in that I know better days are coming, that changes our attitude about life. When Jesus sits in the upper room in John chapter 14, and he says, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. I know what you're about to go through. I would argue that those apostles that night went through one of the darkest periods of their life. And yet what happened 3 days later? Jesus is standing in the room with them. And they're questioning the fact that the resurrection even took place to begin with. Life has a particular balance. One day your best friend can be crucified on a cross. 3 days later, all of a sudden he's standing in your room. But just as it is with bad things going to dark, or light, so it can be that light is going to darkness. And we talked about this a little bit in the class, but there may be somebody here this morning that is going through a period where it just seems like they are skyrocketing. Maybe 4 months ago you invested in Dogecoin. Yeah, I'll put $10,000 in Dogecoin. All of a sudden now I've got $18 million. Cryptocurrency works like that. I don't know. Maybe you're going through this amazing skyrocketing period. The problem is that, at some point, it won't always be like that. Now, should you treat this moment as a very fatalistic attitude and just say, well, I better just blow it all now because it's going to be gone next week? No. But recognize that there are going to come dark days. And after that, there will come good days. And then after that, there will come dark days. Life has a particular balance. And that's what the person here in Luke chapter 13 didn't realize. In Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 32, this whole story begins with somebody saying, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus says your perspective is all out of whack. And then he tells this parable about a guy who builds barns. And he thinks to himself, and I love how he refers to himself because it's so elementary. He says, I'm going to say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And then God comes in that same night. He says your life is required of you this very night. You didn't see that coming. Guess what happened? There's a particular balance to things. And even though you're at the stage in your life where you're building barn after barn and you're tearing down barns, build bigger barns, life has a particular balance. Because you could be alive one day and dead the next. You just don't know. In Psalm 30, for instance. Psalm 30, verse 6. Psalm 30 and verse 6. He says, and how many of us have ever said this? Psalm 30, verse 6. Now, as for me, I said in my prosperity, I will never be moved. O Lord, by your favor, you have made my mountain to stand strong. You hid your face, and I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I called, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my blood? If I go down to the pit, will the dust praise you, will declare your faithfulness? Notice how he says he'll never be moved, and then in the very next phrase, he is moved. What happened? Verse 10, Hear, O Lord, and be gracious to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and girded me with gladness, that my soul may sing praise to you and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever. In Psalm 30, verses 6 through 12, the common denominator of these verses is that he keeps his eye and his focus on God. I will not be moved. That's Psalm 23 in a nutshell. He leads me beside quiet waters. He stills my soul. When my focus is on God, it doesn't matter what the balance of this world is. There can be good times, there can be bad times. But if my focus is on God, then I can weather those good times and those bad times. Will they be painful? Absolutely. Will I need help? Yes. But I can weather those times. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie The Walk. It's by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Came out, or he stars in it. It came out a few years ago. I had the absolute misfortune of watching it in the theater. What this movie is essentially recreates the story, I think, in the 90s, where this French tightrope walker strings a line across the then World Trade Centers and tightrope walks across it. The reason I say that I had the misfortune of seeing is because I experienced the first time in my life what I think vertigo feels like. Because you have this camera that shows this guy holding this magnificent pole walking across a tightrope wire across these two buildings, these thousands of feet in the air, whatever it is. And you see the clouds and the birds underneath them. It's a very unsettling physical experience. But I noticed something when I watched that movie, and something that I've learned about tightrope walkers to begin with, is that they keep their eyes focused. They keep that long pole because they're trying to eliminate as many variables as possible. The whole point of the pole, the whole point of the focus, is to eliminate the bend in the knees, all the different things that can go wrong. And so if they can keep their focus on the point where they're going, they're not distracted by the horizon, not distracted by the wind and the birds and all the different emotions that can come in, the different sensory experiences that can come in and throw off their concentration. That focus is pivotal. The focus is pivotal in our life too. If you remember when Peter got out of the boats and walked towards Jesus, when did things start going wrong? When it says he noticed the winds and the waves around him. When our focus is on God, that particular balance that life throws at us, we're able to weather much more able. Because we have an understanding of the master of the universe, which is God, number 3. I would argue to you that life exists within those seasons. I know a lot of people, and I've been guilty of this, probably more than I care to admit. I know a lot of us that fight against these things. That when things go bad, we try to brute force just stop it in its tracks. And there is times when that's appropriate. You can do it, more power to you. But when it just seems like things are going haywire, when it seems like things are just going amazing, remember that life exists within that balance. And it's that impermanence of life that I would argue is where life is lived. I love what the Dalai Lama had to say. He said, awareness of impermanence and appreciation of our human potential will give us a sense of urgency that we must use every precious moment. Did you hear what he had to say? He said, understanding that our lives are temporary and understanding that our lives are in flux is what helps give us a sense of urgency. I like what Carl Jung had to say. He said, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Let me read that again. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. In other words, when you're going through an especially light period, you understand that there are going to be dark periods. And just as importantly, when you're going through a dark period, you understand that there's going to be light periods in the future. Understand that life is not always going to be 100% one thing and 100% another thing. It is going to be this binary world that we live in. That's where life is. And understanding and appreciating those things are vital to us existing in this world. In Psalm 37, a few pages over from where you're probably at. Psalm 37 and verse 7. He says, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Don't fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who carries out wicked schemes. That's a very down-to-earth statement. Don't worry when you see evildoers prospering. Cease from anger, forsake wrath. Don't fret, it only leads to evil doing. For evildoers, verse 9, will be cut off. But those who wait for the Lord, they're going to inherit the land. Yet a little while, and the wicked man will be no more. And you will look carefully for his place, and he won't be there. The humble will inherit the land, and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. It's very easy for us to look at our lives through kind of a distorted lens and say, well, I look out, I'm doing everything right. I've got my ducks in a row. I'm at services every time the doors are open. I'm praying as much as I should. I'm reading my Bible as often as I can. And yet I look over and Jim just got the promotion. You know how he got that promotion? By cheating. He went out drinking with the boss. If I had done that, maybe I'd be in that position. That's when we start to look at kind of things from a distorted viewpoint. What Psalmist says in Psalm 37 is, don't envy those people. If you see people that are living their life immorally, sinfully, and doing things that are wrong, they may prosper in the short term, but they're not going to prosper in the long term. Life exists within these binary systems. It exists within these extremes, and the understanding of those extremes is what helps us live our life. You see this type of balance literally on every single page. For instance, when Mary and Martha are trying to entertain Jesus, and Mary is serving, and Martha is listening to Jesus. And maybe have that backwards. Martha is serving, Mary is listening to Jesus. Martha comes up and says to Jesus, I wish that you would tell Mary, my sister, to come in and help me. There's nothing wrong with serving. There's nothing wrong with cleaning. But Jesus says she has chosen that good part. You need to understand that in this moment, the most important thing is not cleaning up the kitchen. The most important thing is listening to what I have to say. You see passages like this everywhere. For instance, when you look at the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, where they divide the sheep on one side and the goats on this side. This is very binary system. The thing that defined them was the hospitality and everyday scenarios. Now, is that the only thing God requires? No. Is that one of the big things? Yes. Life exists, and some of those things are not as clearly defined for us. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Jump over to that. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. After he gets done talking about there's time for this and time for that. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting verse 9. He says, "What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? For I have seen the task which God has given to the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. God has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even until the end. And I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There is nothing to take away from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. That which has been is already, that which has been already, and that which is already, which will be, has already been. For God sees what is passed by." In this season where he talks about time for this and time for that, time for this and time for that, he says a few things. Number one, God has set everything appropriate in his time. And I know that God will have all things appropriate in their time. This thing will happen at this appropriate time. This thing will happen appropriate at this time. But I also know, Solomon says, that man has an eternity in their heart. That God has set within us some kind of eternal understanding. And we realize that even though our lives are finite, the ultimate understanding of the universe is eternal. And that even though I don't know what my life is going to be like tomorrow, I understand that God is in control. I understand that the signs and the seasons and the things that take place may go up, they may go down, but I understand that ultimately my role is to serve him, as he said, and keep his commandments. I debated on saying this, but it's just a cheesy line. So is there a time for the sermon to begin, so is there a time for the sermon to end. Everybody can just kind of breathe a sigh of relief. I know that's cheesy, but I couldn't resist. I don't want to leave this morning, though, negating the idea that there is a time for us to make our lives right with God. And if you're here this morning and for some reason you've been putting off, you say, well, it's not the right time for me to become a Christian. It's not the right time for me to do this. It's not the right time for me to get my life right. Whether that's for repentance, whether that's for baptism, whatever the situation is, I guarantee you it is the right time. The reason I know that is because it may be the only time. You have this opportunity right now to get your life right with God. Don't wait another second if you don't want to, or if you don't have to. Do it now as we stand and as we sing.